All right, good morning, everybody. We seem to be up. Perfect. So first slot of the day is usually one that you tend to try and avoid as a speaker, but as I was going through the program for the conference, I realized that there is a lot of really experienced knowledge that's going to be presented over the next couple of days. And I'm doing more of the shallow overview type of a whole bunch of different topics. So the progression actually works out really well. I'm going to be covering a lot of the stuff that, as we're designing, we probably shouldn't be doing. And then the rest of the speakers, I'm going to turn it over to them and have them go into depth in a lot of these points that I'm going to be making and explain what we should be doing instead. So I think that's a really good setup for the day. And kudos to Krein and PPK for actually looking at the content and putting together this schedule that makes a lot of logical sense. Good job, guys. So this is me on Twitter. If for some reason you don't want to use the hashtag and you want to send questions directly to me, you can do that. If you've got any follow-up thoughts, go ahead. I will be watching you and spilling water all over my clicker. This is going well so far. It's a morning thing. I'm not a morning person, can you tell? Let's see if we can get this thing back together. I'm going to start with a story as I'm doing this. So I live in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and yes, the flight was quite long. We had a sporting event about 3 years ago. Maybe you heard of it. It was called the Olympics. And the way Vancouver is set up, the way it's laid out, I was in the middle of where all the action was happening. So I did what I thought any sane person would do, and I went as far away as I could. I spent the 2 weeks during the Olympics touring around the South Island of New Zealand with my wife. We rented a car, we drove around, we had no particular plan as we went. We just pulled into small towns and booked hotels as we went. The thing about the Southern Hemisphere that I didn't realize ahead of time is that data connectivity is actually a little in the Stone Ages. You don't have free Wi-Fi anywhere. We weren't able to get our laptops up and running, so those basically sat in the bag. On the other hand, we did buy SIM cards, and we were able to use our mobile data as we went. So our phones were our entire lifeline to the rest of the world. And this came into play when, near the end of the trip, we decided, instead of this system of pulling into towns and booking hotels last minute, we wanted a little bit more of that settled in advance. We didn't want to have to think too much on the last day. So I'm going to say it was on a Wednesday evening. We were at a hotel in a different town, and we decided to book for 2 days in advance, the Friday evening. I pulled out my phone. I found some booking sites for the Southern Hemisphere. And I mean, keep in mind, this was 2010. Mobile had started becoming a thing at that point. We were building mobile sites, but not everyone had got the message yet. And of course, these sites were terrible. I found the one that I thought I could actually work with, and I went through this really frustrating process of zooming into the form and filling out each field, and then zooming back out to see the entire context of the form and see how much left I had to fill out. Submitting the form, realizing I missed a field in all that zooming, getting error messages, and continuing to do that until finally I managed to book this hotel room. Or so I thought. When we rolled into Christchurch, New Zealand, the last town before we were heading out of the country, I went to the hotel and I said, "Hey, we're here to check in." He punched our names into the computer and couldn't find the reservation. I thought, well, that's funny. I've got the confirmation email here on my phone. Why don't you take that code and punch it in? So he managed to find it, and it turned out that throughout all of that form submission stuff, the dates that I'd booked for had reset, and I booked for Wednesday instead of Friday, the day that we actually needed the hotel. So New Zealand still owes me $100. But this is an example of the mobile user experience letting me, as a user, down. And this is the sort of thing that we're doing all the time, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Maybe we're providing a poor experience. Maybe our sites aren't rendering properly. Maybe they're actually broken in some way. And it's not just us, it's the big guys too. These are sites from companies that actually make mobile browsers. I'm not pointing these out to make fun of them, but it's clear that there's a message here. Mobile web design ain't easy. So let's get into this talk. I'm going to define my terms ahead of time here. What's an antipattern? Every day, we make design decisions, and we make them to solve a very specific problem. Sometimes we solve those problems in a way that meets our goals, but gets in the way of the user. And sometimes those solutions become standard ways of operating. That's an anti-pattern. I'm going to take some liberties with the actual term. I'm not going to just focus on the end results. I'm going to take a little bit of a look at workflow and strategy as part of this as well. The story I just told you is what got me thinking about this talk in the first place. And I put together a collection of some of the things that I've come across in my own usage, stuff that I've been guilty of doing myself, and just things that I think we should be really thinking about and potentially doing a better job of. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that WTFmobileweb.com and mobile web best practices were kind of a yin-yang, this is the bad stuff you shouldn't do, this is the good stuff you should do instead, resource for putting together this talk. They're an absolute goldmine of what you shouldn't do on the mobile web and what you should. So I've broken the talk down into 3 major categories. They're kind of rough, but we'll start with strategy, we'll talk about user interface, and we'll finish with production and coding. So the first strategic one is probably the most obvious, not having a mobile site in the first place. You're crazy not to have a mobile site these days, right? Well, there's some subtleties here that I think are actually worth discussing, things that you and I might take for granted, but a business is actually evaluating what they should do about mobile that might be a roadblock for them. It might cause them to think this through a little bit more. And this is something that I see at the day job at Mobify. I spent a lot of time over the last 10 years freelancing before I took this job last year. And during that time, I was kind of in the position of being at the end of the decision-making process. Over the last year, I've seen that decision-making process within our customers and our clients a little bit more closely. And I've watched as they've evaluated their mobile strategies. It turns out that they're thinking about this very carefully. Businesses evaluate all of their possibilities. Responsive really isn't the default yet at this moment in time. We're increasingly hearing about it. They're coming to us and asking about responsive, especially in the past year. The interest has gone way up, and people seem to be a whole lot more informed. But it's still not the default option that everyone just assumes they need to have. Not even mobile is the default option. Sometimes the question that they're asking is, can I justify the money that I spend on this on the returns that I'm going to see? Some people still answer that with a no. I'm going to say they're probably wrong, though. There's a couple of reasons why they come to that conclusion. Of course, you have your existing stack. This is one of the biggest considerations. You built a site a couple of years ago. You probably didn't have modern best practices in mind when you built it. And those decisions that you made back in the day aren't necessarily compatible with our modern best practices. How do you add that mobile layer in? Are you going to throw out the entire technology stack? That's not going to happen. Maybe sometime in the future as part of a re-architecture or redesign of the site. But in the meantime, you still have a mobile problem with no clear solution. Another big consideration is, of course, device testing. Not every company out there needs to spend the money building a device lab. Now, for large companies, it's probably a drop in the bucket, but it's not the devices themselves that are costly, it's also having the expertise to test and to respond to the results of the test and roll out changes to your mobile site to improve based on what you find in the devices. That can be quite costly, and for some companies, it's not worth building a team in-house. Instead, they'll look for external contractors to do that work for them. But if you didn't have a mobile site, you'd be in good company. This is Apple.com right now. There is no provision for mobile. And I wasn't in the meetings when they decided what they were going to do here, so I can't tell you with any firsthand perspective, but I think, I'm going to theorize, that they figure their phone is good enough to render the desktop web, because when it came out in 2007, that's all that they had to work with. They had to build a phone that was fantastic for rendering desktop websites. So they've taken that philosophy to heart, and I guess now they have, this absolutely terrible to use site. If you're not Apple and you don't have products that people are going to buy no matter what kind of mobile experience you have, you probably shouldn't be doing this. This is why you should be building mobile sites. User engagement directly correlates to revenue. It turns out that people respond really well to an optimized experience that looks like it was designed for them. You know this. This is why you build mobile sites. Our numbers actually back it up. We have data proving it. When we have a new customer come to us, usually they're launching a new mobile site when they didn't previously have one. And what we see happen is their mobile sales double almost immediately. This happens so often that we promise it now. We just say, if you build a mobile site, your mobile sales will double. And we only promise the doubling, but we often see 3 to 5 times increase in mobile sales. So as a result of that, we actually see full return on investment. All of that money that they spend building the mobile site in the first place comes back out in the increase in mobile sales. And sometimes that happens within a month or even a couple of weeks. There's a couple caveats to that. I mean, we deal mostly with large e-commerce companies with high volumes of sales. If you've got more brochureware sites, probably doesn't quite apply as much. But in situations where a lot of money is changing hands, this is a particularly effective argument to make. So the bottom line is that users really don't care about what approach that you take. What they care about is that you've designed an experience that feels like it was actually built for them. It might cost something up front, but if you do it well, you do make money in the long term. All right, another one that's hopefully fairly obvious. I just came across this term recently. Apparently it's been around for a while, coined by Errol Balkin. A door slam. What's a door slam? It's this. Any modal message, full screen or alert, that interrupts user flow to ask them to download your app. These are the most transparent example I can think of serving the business need over the user need. And as always, XKCD gets to the heart of the problem. These send a very clear message. This says to the user that your mobile site probably isn't good enough, they should be using the app instead. But that's rarely the case. It doesn't work because it's fundamentally targeting the wrong class of users. This is how almost everybody sees that ad. I'm looking for a very specific piece of content, punch it in a search term into Google, I hit your site, and instead of getting that content, you advertise your app to me. I don't care about you. I'm just coming in to see your content. I don't care about this ad. Now, let's say that you've done the right thing, and as soon as I dismiss it, you'll never show me that ad again. Who actually benefits from that? That's people that use your site on a regular basis. That's not me as the person coming in from the search engine. So by definition, the people who would most be interested in your app are probably never seen this ad anyway. It's just a really bad practice, and obviously something that we shouldn't do. If you absolutely have to advertise your app, iOS has this smart banner thing. Other platforms don't have an equivalent, but this is probably the best way to handle it, by getting out of the way and not taking over the entire focus of the experience. But yeah, the best approach is just don't do it. So we're well past the point now where there's really any reason to have a secondary URL for your mobile site. m.yoursite.com is probably the most common example, but of course there's the .mobi top-level domain name as well. Either of those are problematic, and this is why. We know this. SEO is an issue. Google prefers having a single canonical version of all your content. If you spread out the same content across multiple sites, you will get penalized in your search engine listings. You incur redirect delays, bouncing users back and forth between one domain and another. And how much time that takes depends on network conditions and how well you implemented the redirects, but that can affect the user perception. And sharing is an issue because, I mean, we've all seen this. I'm browsing a mobile site and I want to share that link on Twitter. I throw it out there. Everyone who goes there on a desktop computer sees something like this. It's something that you can fix. I mean, you can be super careful about traffic redirection, but you have to make sure that the desktops always see the desktop site and mobile devices always see the mobile site, and it's a very tricky balance to get right. This is a side effect of bad device detection. If I click a link that goes to the desktop site and it says, oh, hey, you're a mobile device, I've got this special site for you, go here instead, and it sends me to the home page. Well, I was linking to a very specific piece of content, and now I can't find it because I can't find my way through your site's information architecture. This is a terrible experience. Luckily, this practice seems to be dropping, and people don't do it as much anymore, but Yeah, that's always been a problem. Best argument that I've heard of for standalone comes from Luke Rubeluski in his site BagCheck. About 2 years ago, he wrote an article about why he actually went with a separate standalone mobile site for BagCheck. There are three main reasons. First of all, reflowing the source order. We know that with responsive, using CSS alone to reposition elements can be a little problematic cross-device. If you want to make drastic changes, that can be a really tricky balance to get right. So reflowing the DOM is often a much easier approach. He took a very thoughtful approach to his URL design. He purposely broke URL parity between desktop and mobile. And the reason he did that is because the desktop site has a lot of modules in it, things like comments and updates and likes, all of those available on one single page. Whereas on the mobile version, he's given each one of those modules its own URL, and only the mobile site will see those. It's an interesting way of optimizing for a mobile device by breaking down your site into smaller chunks. And then finally, he was able to take advantage of device-only features like using the camera to do barcode scanning. That requires a little bit of extra interface. Doesn't make as much sense to have that on the desktop. So unless you have very carefully considered reasons like Luke's, we really shouldn't be breaking the W3C's one web philosophy. If it's the same content, it should be accessible at the same URL, regardless of device. It's really sad that we still visit sites that block certain classes of users, isn't it? Some places do this on purpose. You're going to tell me that I have to come back to your site with a different device? You've probably lost me as a user. Why would we ever do this? Because of development costs? Probably better to be explicit about mobile not being supported. Put up a disclaimer if you have to, rather than actually blocking users. Even a suboptimal experience is better than actively being shut down. Now, it's not always intentional, like those first two examples. Sometimes it's just a matter of bad device detection. This site on the left thinks I'm a desktop browser for some reason. The site on the right, well, I am a desktop browser, and it's telling me to come back on a desktop browser. There's more subtle ways of blocking as well. If you force users to stay on your mobile site without a link back to the desktop site, there may not be the content that they're looking for on that mobile site. What Al Jazeera does up here, there's a link up in the top right corner to website. I might word that a little better because I'm pretty sure that's what I'm looking at right now, but what that does is it lets me go back to the desktop website from my phone. Unless you're not hiding any content at all from different classes of devices, you probably should still have this because I might need that content at some point. It's a really easy thing to do. It's a very quick win. We should be providing those links. So our site should always be open to everybody. We shouldn't be segregating by type of device. This one's really short and sweet. I run into this myself all the time. Simulators are fantastic. It's really easy to get lulled into desktop-only testing. Hey, it renders in the simulator. It's probably going to render on the phone, right? You can often get away with that too because you're just testing rendering, and mobile browsers are quite good at most of the common rendering tasks. But rendering usually isn't the problem that the device testing is going to expose. We can't get a sense of how well the site is going to perform. We're sheltered from any load time issues, any performance issues, any interaction problems by using the touchscreen we can't simulate with a mouse. So I'm as guilty of this as anyone. I mean, I often leave testing for like the last pass on the device before we actually launch the site, and that comes back and bites me when I find that this fundamental design decision that I made early on in the process, well, it actually didn't work out too well, and I'm going to have to go back to the drawing board and figure out a different way to do this on the device. So I would have saved time if I tested earlier. Getting on devices as soon as possible and often is obviously what we should all be doing. One last quick strategic one before we move on to user interface. The waterfall method of development is really not so useful anymore. It really doesn't capture what the reality is. I mean, Photoshop is great for polishing pixels. I use it every day. But the problem is we're moving past an era where static mock-ups make sense anymore. We have to design interactions and user flows. We have to figure out what our breakpoints look like. what our sites are going to look like on all these screens that are now available. Static images don't really do a good job of capturing that. You can get around that a little bit. There's some partial solutions like, saving out tons of screenshots or using layer comps in Photoshop, but they're more trouble than they're worth, and you can't interact with them anyway. So the design process needs to move out of Photoshop a lot earlier. Pixel-perfect PSDs that we hand over for production, that's a practice that needs to die. In my design process now, I aim to get into code as soon as I possibly can. That way I get earlier feedback about what's working and what I need to change. I can make those big changes a lot sooner rather than having this very polished piece that I have to go back and completely disrupt. Allows me to preview on device earlier, going back to that last point. And it gets me information that only testing in the browser can tell me. Can people actually use this? Is the responsive version working at all, or do I have to really rethink how I'm going to approach that? Do I need to rethink any of those really big design decisions? So my modern process looks a little bit more like this. I don't actually have any specific methodology that I follow, but the reality is, like, when I look at how the sites that I'm working on and the products that I'm working on are developed, there's no good way of describing it. The design and the implementation necessarily have to go hand in hand. They have to happen simultaneously. I need to be able to talk to the developers and work directly with them to figure out some of the big design challenges. They need to be able to come to me and tell me why my designs are not implementable for some reason or another. And any of these other parts of the process can potentially impact that. They can make changes to how we thought we were going to go. User testing might reveal we have this fundamental problem, or the requirements might shift a little bit, and we just have to go back to the drawing board. So it really helps when design and development can work in tandem like this. What's interesting is that a lot of my design time is actually spent in the browser's inspector these days. I like to get in there and tweak live values until they're just right, because a lot of things are way easier to do in the browser than in Photoshop. I mean, Photoshop is great for that initial design thinking. It's fantastic for production, but it still totally sucks for things like tweaking text or the spacing between elements or reflowing layouts. So the browser's inspector is where I do a lot of that work now. I go in there and I make adjustments to live code that's running in the browser, and as soon as I'm done, I have the ability to just pull those right back out and commit them directly to the code base. Now, the disadvantage to this approach, of course, is that it's really hard to do any sort of visual design thinking in a code editor. You get limited to box model thinking, and you're not producing nearly the quality of work that you would be in Photoshop. So I see these two tools as being very complementary in my design workflow, and I think increasingly this is the way we're going to be building sites. Both tools have their place. It's just about knowing when to use one or the other, and a workflow that allows you to easily move back and forth between them. I really love this idea. It came about from Dan Mall last year. He says, don't design in the browser, decide in the browser. It really captures how I do things now. I start with the styling and layout, broad strokes in Photoshop. Then I'm going to move to the browser for further exploration. Then I'll take what I do in the browser, bring it back into Photoshop via screenshot or some other way, add some extra polish to it, bring it back to the browser, and I just keep going back and forth like that, and I take a very iterative approach. It gets really messy to describe, but it's fun, and I think it's a necessary way of building these days. All right, let's move on to user interface. Again, we'll start with a fairly obvious one. Assuming what the user is seeing is a problem. This is a great indicator of that kind of thinking, the add to home screen pattern. You get this pop-up that says, tap this arrow or whatever to add our site to your home screen. Except if I'm coming in with anything other than what the default browser on the operating system is, what arrow is it that I'm supposed to click? I don't see an arrow in any of these. So what's happening here is that they're making an assumption about my particular browser configuration, and anything else that I view it in, that assumption falls apart. Referencing anything in the surrounding user interface, anything that you don't directly control, is probably a bad idea. I would say don't tell a user to tap a specific button that you can't control, because you don't know it's there, and it may change at any given point. If the browser comes along and redesigns the layout of the buttons, that goes away. So you really don't know anything about the user's environment. You don't know the browser. You don't know the screen size. You can try and sniff those, but browsers are going to lie to you frequently. Best strategy is operate under the assumption that you're totally blind to what the end user is actually operating with. Let's move on to touch targets. How many of you knew that Canadians had tiny fingers? This is unusably small navigation. Thankfully, the site has since been redesigned. This is a number that we bat around. 44 pixels is kind of the commonly suggested smallest viable tap target. But that's an irrelevant number because it's locked to pixels per inch. Mobile pixel density is all over the place. We're starting at about 150 on the low end and going all the way up to about 450 for new devices like the HTC One. It's not about pixels, it's about physical dimensions. Which dimensions should we target? Every operating system offers inconsistent advice on this. I think it's Nokia that says 7 millimeters is your comfortable minimum. iOS says 12 meters is your comfortable minimum. That's actually a pretty big range. And unfortunately, our fingers are anywhere from 15 to 20 millimeters. So 12 seems like it's probably the very, very basic minimum if we want to make a comfortable tap target. And keep in mind that thumbs are about 25% bigger than fingers too. So if your interface allows heavy thumb usage, you probably want to go even larger than that. And an old HCI convention called Fitts' Law comes into play here. Fitts' Law states that acquiring a target is faster if that target is larger. And conversely, the user errors for acquiring that target decrease as the target gets bigger. And that totally applies to touchscreens. And this tells us that the larger our targets are, the easier the interface is going to be to use. We also have to think about the placement of key interface elements. There's a lot of optimal areas where touching is easier or harder on an interface. And those differ based on not only the device, but how that device is held. You can't really assume that if I'm right-handed, I'm going to hold the device in one hand or the other, because everyone will probably have a different take on this. I might be a little more comfortable holding it in my right hand and using my left, whereas another right-handed person would do it the other way. And same for left-handed people. So we also need to think about visibility. As I'm using an interface, my pointer, my finger, is going to be covering up key user interface elements, and what I'm trying to tap on is something that's going to be blocked by the mere action of trying to tap on it. So that forces users to slow down a little bit and second guess whether the action they're trying to perform is going to work the way they intend it to. And yeah, it can slow down the entire operation of our interfaces. So how do we cope with this? Well, when in doubt, make your targets bigger. Fitts' Law thinks that's a great idea. We should be doing that. If you have the flexibility, use fewer targets if you can get away with it. The problem with that earlier Canadian Tire menu that I showed you is that they're just trying to shove way too much on screen, and as a result, shrinking everything down. If you remove the number of elements you're trying to expose, that allows more space for the ones that are on screen. And the less choice, the less second guessing from the user. So it makes the ones that remain quite a bit more visible. We have these brilliant new displays on our devices that make everything look absolutely amazing. And our natural tendency is to serve the best possible images to those screens. Take advantage of all those extra pixels and make our work look as good as it can, right? Except that can be a really bad idea because those images are big. They're really big. They're often 4 times the size. And yeah, they look great, but they come with a really big bandwidth hit. Your loading times are going to slow down. You're going to chew through your data plan quite a bit quicker. And this one really hits me because I'm roaming right now, and I'm scared to death of opening a web page that has a high DPI image because I have no idea how much that's going to cost me. So the question we should be asking is, does that image actually need to be that sharp? Is a lower resolution version of that image that much more noticeable? Can you save it as a vector image instead? It's best to operate as high DPI being an opt-in choice. Don't just provide high-res assets for absolutely everything. Take each image case by case if you can. I expect this one to be extremely controversial. I'm going to talk about the fold. As an industry, we spend a lot of time convincing ourselves that the fold is dead. Surely people know how to scroll, right? And on mobile devices, that's even more prominent because we have a lot less pixels to deal with. But I'm going to argue that there is one instance where it does still actually matter. Any key business conversion tools on your site, I'm talking about things like add to cart buttons, get a quote, links, things like that that are tied directly to revenue, those should probably be visible on page load. And that's a really hard thing to do with a couple hundred pixels of vertical space, and it can present a lot of design challenges, which is probably a good reason why we don't think about it that much. And I don't mean this kind of design. I don't mean cramming everything that you possibly can into that top space for the sake of visibility, because that's self-defeating and that's just terrible design. This is not what we're talking about. I mean more subtle design decisions like this. This is a product display page. How do I add that to my cart? I'm going to have to scroll down. That's pretty obvious, right? If instead this page were to have that button visible on page load, the page would convert better. More people would add that product to their cart and continue through and buy it. This is an observed behavior. We've seen this at work. We've seen what happens before and after taking a button that's below the fold and moving it above. If you can see it immediately before scrolling down, that does increase the amount of user engagement. So again, don't load everything that you can in that space, but if you can take a page and you can distill it down to one key action that you want users to perform, that key action should probably be available when the page first loads. Who can tell me what these are? Nice to know I'm not the only old-timer in the room here. Just how obsolete is the floppy disk anyway? I was pressing out USB keys the other day, and a 32 gigabyte USB key runs somewhere around the range of 15 euro. 32 gigs is about 22,000 floppy disks, and if you stack those up one on top of each other, that pile would be 50 meters high. So why exactly is that icon being used on a mobile device? Where's the floppy drive that I'm saving my work onto? We've gotten so used to that icon that a large number of people sat in a meeting and said, yep, that's the best way to go for that particular problem. What's a better icon? What should we be using instead? Seems like every year there's challenges issued to redesign the save icon, and people come up with these ideas. But why do we even have an icon anymore? Devices are stateless. We're automatically saving users' work. Increasingly, desktop sites are stateless, and we're starting to move away from the concept of save being necessary. We actually use a lot of anachronistic icons when you think about it. Who here owns a TV with rabbit ears? No one? Who's ever seen a tape reel answering machine? In my experience, oh, we have a couple hands, okay. In my experience, those don't exist. I've never seen that. That's not something I can relate to. For that matter, who uses a magnifying glass to search their house for items? Should we care? Should we go out and replace all of these icons with modern equivalents? Maybe not. This is a study done with a group of 18 to 25-year-olds. They were asked to identify the origin and the meaning of 9 common icons that we use in interfaces today. Many of these are actually direct references to obsolete technology, and yet most were fairly well recognized. Something like 80% or more of the people who were asked to recognize them managed to. Anachronistic icons are not inherently bad. Just because the technology is outdated doesn't necessarily mean that the concept isn't valid anymore. The definition of an icon is a thing regarded as a representative symbol of a concept. Good symbols are often abstract. They don't have inherent meaning. They get meaning through convention and repetitive use. This rounded triangle, it doesn't communicate anything, but if I put an exclamation mark inside of it, all of a sudden it becomes an alert. It's not because that's what an alert looks like. It's because through convention, we've conditioned ourselves to think that's what an alert should be. So if there's a conventional action, okay, just got my time check. If there's a conventional icon for an action, we should probably be using it. People recognize common symbols, and it's useful to tap into that rather than redesigning the wheel every time. Except, I think we should still let the floppy disk die. We seem to have come full circle on mobile. There was this concept going around in the late 90s. A guy named Vincent Flanders coined the term mystery meat navigation, which refers to image-based nav without any textual hints. You had no idea what you'd get when you click through. And we seem to be back. We've rebalanced toward unlabeled icons as being all right. And it's really easy to see why. I mean, with limited space on a touchscreen, we have to make design trade-offs. There's often not a lot of room for both the icon and the label. Gestures count here too. Any gesture that isn't intuitive is a non-discoverable gesture. It can be very hard to find some of these more obscure gestures on your own. We need to be trained to use them. And it doesn't really help that our operating systems and browsers already hijack some of the most intuitive gestures. Just tapping on an item, a single finger swipe, and pinching to zoom, those are all very, very easily understood gestures. We've probably all seen the videos of the 2-year-olds using iPads, right? You don't need to think too hard about those. But it's hard to consider using any of those in our interfaces because they're already reserved for specific uses. This is a good example of what I mean. I actually use mobile Chrome as my default browser. And it's got a convention where if I slide from the far left edge over to the right, I can switch back and forth between tabs. The problem is when I'm using an image carousel, or if I've got a large image that's loaded and I'm trying to pan around it by swiping as well, if I move my finger just a little bit too far to the edge of the screen, instead of moving around within the page, I'm moving between tabs, which is a very unexpected thing to have happen. So because we've got this one gesture with 2 different actions that vary only by starting positions, it's really hard to know what to expect. And it's training me not to swipe at all because I can't predict the outcome. So unexpected interactions are a typical symptom of mystery meat navigation. If I didn't understand why it happened, it's probably not repeatable. Now, even if you are relying on these common gestures, we should also be providing visual hints. Make it evident that these exist. Here's a convention that we may have seen where the image in the middle has a couple of images on either side, which hint that there's more content off screen. I think this would be an even better example if there were actual visible on-screen controls, obvious targets that the user should be interacting with. But in this case, implied interaction might be enough. So the takeaway here is that we should be documenting everything. In the case of icons, we should be providing text labels if we can. In the case of gestures, there should be visual affordances on screen. The best policy here is to ensure that if the action is visible in the UI, ensure that the action is visible in the UI. We shouldn't be relying on invisible interactions. Speaking of gestures, forcing any form of mouse interaction is probably a very bad idea. Hover being the classic one. We all know there's no hover on a touch screen. We don't talk about right-click nearly as much. There is kind of an equivalent of right-click where you can tap and hold and pull up a secondary contextual menu. That's a thing that we have. It's a gesture we have, and we can hook into that with JavaScript. But have you ever tried to explain right-click to a not very computer literate person that you know? It's an advanced concept that isn't nearly as well understood as we kind of hope it would be. Right-click is basically a power user feature. I think we ought to consider that tap and hold gesture to also be a power user feature. It's got the same limitations. It's an invisible gesture. It's not discoverable. So any replacement for right-click in our interfaces may not be the best way to go. Now, our interactions are getting a lot more complicated too. We've had all along this model where touch would be a mobile device and a mouse pointer would be a desktop computer. But devices like the Surface are coming along and changing that, leading to problems like this. It's a whole new class of device, and it's breaking existing UI conventions. Luckily, we do have some CSS4 media queries coming out to help us figure this out. The hover query will target whether a device has hover capability or not. The pointer query will allow us to choose whether the pointer is fine, otherwise known as a mouse cursor, coarse, a finger, or none at all, which would be useful in the case of assistive technology. But here's a thought. If your site heavily relies on mouse actions, those components might not be best for mobile anyway. If you're using hover to open a drop-down menu, you probably want to think about refactoring that menu. You can't really rely on that behavior being present. Because your users are increasingly accustomed to using multiple input methods, this is something we have to start planning for. So we'll move on to the final bit, and I know I'm running a little low on time, so I'll try and get through this quickly here. This one's a little bit more complicated. There's a balance that we have to strike between just getting the job done and creating an experience that feels appropriate for each device, and those two can be in conflict. A good example of this is our tables. How do we take those large data tables and make them work on a small screen? Common way of dealing with that is hiding unimportant columns. Well, which columns in a table like this are the unimportant ones? If I reflow it to some other way of running the table, I might lose scannability. There's not a lot of good options, just a lot of not very great ones. Starbucks actually does a really good job of it now. They used to have a site where they would hide a bunch of the, I guess, secondary information like carbs and fat and just give you the calories and the items. But that's problematic because if I'm standing in line and I'm looking at the display case, how am I going to find out what item behind that display case meets my dietary needs? I'll probably use my phone. And if I'm getting incomplete nutritional data, then that doesn't work for me. But they've redesigned and they've actually done a pretty good job of it. So what they do now is they take that table and reflow it linearly. It takes a little bit of work to achieve this, but it's a good compromise between having the information present and having it readable. Another UI component that seems easy on the outset, but does cause interaction problems, is this very popular responsive nav pattern. Take a list of navigation items and refactor it with a little bit of minimal JavaScript to an HTML select element. Easy to implement, seems logical, but turns out we shouldn't actually do this. The way that a native select is implemented on some devices is problematic because there's an observed behavior when users see a list of items, they want to see the entire thing before making a decision. Even if the item at the very top is the one that they're ultimately going to select and they know that, they want to make sure they've seen all their choices before making that selection. And if you've got an implementation that pops up that select as only half of the screen, that's not an optimal way of presenting that data. Microsoft's accordion nav is actually a much better model here. They've got a menu button, you tap on it, it brings up your top level navigation and progressively discloses by tapping on more items, more navigation that you can interact with. And if you keep scrolling, eventually you get lost in this sea of blue. But this is better than the HTML select because users have the ability to see at a glance all of the options if they so choose. So sometimes using the right component requires a little bit of extra work. You may need to swap out components, maybe even maintain a couple of different versions for different screen sizes. But often that is the right decision for your users. There's this weird thing happening right now where we seem to be increasingly comfortable with using uncompressed images. The art of image optimization seems to be dying for some reason. Anybody see this site? This is a single page site from Oakley. It's one page, it's got some videos on it, it's got some 3D product tours, it's got some scrolling parallax effects. How big could that page possibly be? 5 megs? 10 megs? How about 89.5 megs? Ironically, there's a banner up in the top right. They won a Site of the Day award. It's an extreme example, but the point remains, our page load times are going up really fast. Earlier on this year, we were talking about the average page on the web being about 1 meg. Sounds like these days it's even closer to 1.5 megs. Reason for this is, yeah, we're using a lot more JavaScript libraries, but honestly, I don't think we're doing enough with our images. We're providing more of them, we're providing heavier images, higher density images. We're going for visual lushness over site performance. Maybe there's an argument to be made for scaling back on some of our image use in general, but uncompressed images, there should be no argument over that. So I'm going to pick on Oakley a little bit more. One of the reasons why they failed so hard with that site is they didn't optimize any of the images. Which one is the original, which one is the compressed version that I came up with? You can't really see a difference, right? I ran the image through an app called Image Alpha. I stripped out the 24-bit color and converted it down to 128 color, and saved that out. Then I took another pass through an app called Image Optim, which throws a whole bunch of image compression algorithms at any image that you give it and tries to shrink it down as much as possible. And if I wanted to go a step further, I could convert it to WebP. The problem with WebP right now is that it's not well supported, so I'd have to probably save out both a PNG and a WebP image and then selectively serve it to browsers. How did I do? Well, the before image is actually the one on the right, and it started out as 1.5 meg. There's almost no difference between them. If I zoomed in a little bit, the one on the left, you'd see it's a little less saturated, and you see some more banding and artifacts, but I got it down to 470K. And the WebP version was 300K. So if we extrapolate that out across 89.5 megs, we could have done a lot better there. I don't know when we decide we shouldn't do this anymore, but we really, really should optimize all of our images. How's my time, guys? Am I done? Tim? Done? Okay. There's a couple more points here that I'm not going to be able to get to, unfortunately, but that's okay. I'll get these slides online after. Thanks very much.
All right. Thanks, Dave. That was fantastic. I wish we could have let you go a little bit further. I would have loved to hear the rest of the stuff you had. So while Steven's setting up, though, there were a couple questions that came through. First off, I like the don't assume anything. I think that that's a good rule of thumb, and I think that's kind of the underlying theme for your entire presentation there to some point. You know, every one of those bad choices along the way come from some sort of incorrect assumption. One of the questions that was posed was, you know, if you're designing for, you started to talk a little bit about the hybrid devices, multiple input, you know, the kind of devices. If you're designing for those, how do you avoid the lowest common denominator kind of design becoming a design for the worst possible scenario kind of a thing? Like, what's the difference between smart defaults and like actually optimizing and enhancing that experience in a good way?
Oh man, that is a fantastic question. I mean, progressive enhancement seems like the obvious one to throw out there, but like that's not going to get you all the way. Like, if you want to build a really engaging interface that takes advantage of the highest level, then you can't really treat it as enhancements that you throw in after. There has to be a fundamental part of your design process that takes that interaction model into account. I don't think I really have great advice for how you'd balance those two. I think it's going to be unique to everybody's situation, like how far down the chain you can go and keep supporting and not completely water down that experience. Yeah, that's a really bad non-answer, unfortunately. But
so is it safe to say that the defaults, though, like whatever those smart defaults are, those are going to vary based on the company then, correct? I mean, like in some cases, will it make sense for the smart default to be the touch-based interface with the large, you know, but in other cases, may that not be the case? May that be something you want to avoid?
I think I'm just going to go back to like classic web design advice. Look at your user base. You know, who's actually accessing your site? Who do you want to be accessing your site? Should be everybody. That, you know, that should be the right answer there. But if you definitely see a large user base on much more modern browsers than the general web, you can probably get away with pushing that quite a bit higher.
And one more thing while they're finishing setting up that came up was you talked about the mobile forms, which they do suck to fill out. Is there any advice for making those better?
Yeah, that's the whole other presentation, unfortunately. There's a lot of stuff that we could be doing there. Some of it comes down to making the elements large, making them scrollable so that, you know, you've only got one form element per row and you're not trying to cram too many in there. But yeah, there's a lot more nuance that we could get into that I don't think we have time for.
Fair enough. So if you have more questions on that, just kind of mug him as he walks out off the stage, I guess. And are you going to be available for questions throughout?
Oh yeah, I'll be around for the next couple of days, so yeah.
Perfect. All right, thanks, Dave.
Thanks.